Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of Watchtower in Focus, the show that zooms in on all things JW, bringing the governing body and its teachings and policies under microscopic scrutiny. In this show, we will be examining Watchtower's data collection methods, which are of increasing concern to those still trapped inside the organisation, especially in light of a new database system that has come to the attention of JW Survey thanks to a leaked video. But before we go into further detail, allow me to introduce my guests for this episode. Joining me via Skype are John Redwood, Covert Fade, and Chloe from the JW Survey team. Hello to you all.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Lloyd.
I give my consent for my voice to be used as data in this episode.
Yes, it's important that we get consent so that we're not labelled awful hypocrites by the end of this. But yeah, it's wow, what a complicated issue to talk about, and we've all individually been trying to wrap our heads around this, because I think it's safe to say that we've sort of known about this for a while now, but it's only in the last week or so, due to some emails that we've received at JW Survey, that we've noticed it's starting to become a noticeable problem for Jehovah's Witnesses on the ground. And it's worth stressing at this point, if you're tuning in and you've been an ex-Jehovah's Witness, faded or disfellowshipped for a number of years, maybe even decades, you're probably not going to have heard anything about this, because it's existing Jehovah's Witnesses who are dealing with this issue, but we still feel as though this is something that we need to address. Now, these emails, I'm not going to read them out, because obviously I want to preserve the privacy of the senders, but suffice to say, they have been sent in by physically in, mentally out Jehovah's Witnesses, or Jehovah's Witnesses who have relatives who are attending the meetings. And what they're finding, and these are, I should add, in the European Union, they're finding that elders are approaching Jehovah's Witnesses with a form demanding, essentially, or requiring the consent of the publisher for Watchtower to collect and manage personal data. But probably it would be easier if we actually read the form to you. And Chloe, I know you have a copy of the form in front of you. It's actually titled Notice and Consent for Use of Personal Data. So Chloe, what does that form say?
It says, upon becoming a publisher, I acknowledge that the worldwide religious organization of Jehovah's Witnesses, including my congregation, local branch office, and similar cooperating organizations of Jehovah's Witnesses, lawfully uses my personal data in accordance with its legitimate religious interests. Additionally, I consent to the use of my personal data so that I may participate in some religious activities in connection with my worship, and so that I may receive spiritual support. I also agree that my personal data may be sent to any of the cooperating organizations of Jehovah's Witnesses, which may be located in countries whose laws provide different levels of data protection that are not always equivalent to the level of data protection in the country in which I currently reside. I have been informed about and had the opportunity to read the use of personal data page available in the privacy policy section of jw.org and available to me as a hard copy upon request. I consent to the use of my personal data as stated on that page, and as it may be amended from time to time. And then there's space for signature and date. And then there's also a section there as well for legal guardians to be able to sign on behalf of minors.
Yeah, so just worth stressing that last point, that legal guardians are signing this on behalf of their children so that data can be collected and stored about legal minors. Now, this form has a deadline Watchtower is expecting European Union Jehovah's Witnesses to sign this form by May the 18th. The actual deadline for the organisation to conform with legislation in this regard is May 25th. And Covert, I was hoping that you could just talk us through the timing of this and why Watchtower wants these forms to be filled in.
Right. Well, basically, there's new European Union legislation coming into force on that May 25th date. And this basically impacts any organisation that's operating in the EU or that has information on citizens who are in the EU. So this would even apply to an organisation like the Jehovah's Witnesses, who may be storing data in the US and might be based in the US, but who have information on EU citizens. And basically, this is all about, and this has come if you've been following the news, you know there's been over the past few years a series of scandals in what's considered to be the misuse of personal data or data that's online that may identify you that's stored digitally. So this is all about the European Union making sure that any data which can identify you as a person is essentially under your control. So if organizations want to store data about you, or any data that might identify you as a person, so your address, your IP address, for example, where you live, anything details about maybe your personal life that could identify who you are, they have to ask your permission first. And if they don't do this, and there's a series of other I can't go into the depths of the legislation because obviously it's quite wide ranging. But it's basically designed to make sure that organizations can't store data that identifies you without your permission. It gives you the right to control that data. There are also theoretically massive fines and even criminal charges involved should an organization be found to be, continually willfully negligent in the use of that data. I believe, for example, if you're a corporation that's found to have been in a serious breach of this, they can fine you 4% of your yearly revenue. It's that serious at its widest extent. So Watchtower hasn't just decided to suddenly do this. This is a response to very powerful new legislation that's being enacted in the EU, but affects any organisation that has data on EU citizens internationally.
Indeed, and just to stress that last point, because it is worth noting, it's a little bit. I've been doing a little bit of homework on this. It's a little bit different if you're just a small business as to how this is going to impact you. But things do change considerably if we're talking about a large organisation or corporation. The maximum fine amount is up to 20 million euros, which works out at around $23.8 million. And as Covert says, that's up to 4%, or up to 4% of the company's annual global turnover. So that's how it impacts Watchtower. I've already mentioned a little bit about how it's impacting on ordinary Jehovah's Witnesses. John, I know that out of all of the team, you are most hands-on when it comes to dealing with our incoming email. What sense do you get regarding the way this is being received by ordinary witnesses in the congregations?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think for the most part, Jehovah's Witnesses have not had to deal with this issue in the past. Myself, growing up at the JW, we had a lot of information collected about us, and we collected a lot of information about other people when we went from door to door, wrote down their names and their addresses and so forth. In terms of personally, we trusted the organization. The congregation would collect emergency information, for example. And I remember just prior to my leaving the organization that I was being pressured quite severely to give the latest information on my address, my telephone numbers, my email addresses, and every possible personally identifying piece of information about me, short of my social security number. That really made me a little bit uncomfortable, and I think that it's starting to make other witnesses uncomfortable to the point where we've had some physically in but mentally out Jehovah's Witnesses actually write to us from several places in Europe among them Italy and I believe Spain. And these are individuals who are quite concerned because they are in this congregation as a mentally out Jehovah's Witness, but they don't want to give their personal information to the congregation because they feel it's a violation of their rights under these new laws and a violation of their privacy. So it remains to be seen what kind of a rebellion, if we can call it that, there might be in terms of persons giving up their information. But I think it's really important that we stress to people that they need to give a lot of consideration to why they're giving up this information, and also whether there are any penalties, and I'm sure we're going to get into this, but whether there are any penalties for declining. Now, the letter that Chloe read, there's an equivalent, that's called the S-290 form that all European JWs will have to sign, but there's an equivalent S-291, which is the instructions that are given to the elders. And it's interesting that one of those instructions says that if anyone declines to sign this new form, that there are consequences to doing that, and that the elders, the service committee, will be then inclined to call the branch office in their country and discuss it with the service department at the branch office. One thing we do know is that the consequences will involve that person's information not being allowed to be mentioned in the congregation or placed up on the information board. That person would no longer be a ministerial servant or an elder or a pioneer or have any privileges of service whatsoever, simply because they refuse to sign this form.
Well, I should just clarify, there is a little bit of ambiguity as to how things would work if you're an existing elder or ministerial servant and you refuse to sign. Now, when you read the documents, it seems fairly clear that if you follow them to their logical conclusion, how could you be an elder or a ministerial servant if you refuse to sign this document? But it isn't, nowhere is it expressly stated, well, here's the procedure for if an elder or ministerial servant refuses to sign. It's just assumed that they will, which again, you know, there are many, many issues with these documents that have come to our attention, and that's one of them. But while we were preparing for this show, and it should just be stated that this is a complicated issue. None of us are experts on data protection. In fact, we were looking at getting a data protection expert on the show, but it just didn't work out for various reasons. But what we do want to do, despite not being experts, is just highlight what some of our concerns are and leave it to you, the audience, to decide what, if any, problems that you think there are and what you feel you need to do about it. And we're going to get into some of the actions that we're recommending later on in the show. But as regards the GDPR regulations, I've compiled a list of our concerns. John Redwood has already mentioned one or two of them. One very obvious concern, in fact, relates to the manner of, or something that is intrinsic to the Jehovah's Witness faith, which is going from door to door and taking records of people without their knowledge. Because anyone who's watching this who's been a Jehovah's Witness will know that if you meet an interested person, you're going to take notes about them, and those notes will include extremely detailed information depending on what they've divulged. So if they've happened to divulge their full name, which they sometimes do, you're going to write down that full name. And if they divulge that they're of a certain religious persuasion, you're going to write down that information. Now, I actually contacted the Information Commissioner's Office. They have a helpline. The Information Commissioner's Office, by the way, is the data protection agency relevant to the United Kingdom. And I expressed this concern, and I'm not able to play back the phone call, even though I recorded it because for legal reasons, but I can tell you what the person on the helpline said when I told them about this issue of witnesses going from door to door and harvesting this data. The lady said, well, that's identifiable information. So in that case, they possibly would need consent. Because if they're talking about an individual's religion, that is special category data. To be honest, they're going to have to get consent off people, meaning that if the GDPR regulations were followed correctly, every person who you record information on in the course of doing the preaching work needs to fill in a consent form to enable you to keep information on them. Covert, I just can't see them doing that.
No, they're not. I mean, most Jehovah's Witnesses don't even consider this, and the logistics involved. I mean, it's hard enough to get a householder to talk to you anyway. It's even harder to engage them in conversation if at the end of it you have to whip out a data consent form and show them all the notes that you're going to write down about them and what you're going to say, and then give them the option to see that information if they want to see it. So everything you're about to write about them. It's extremely difficult. I mean, I believe that the witnesses have already run afoul of this in Finland, one of the Scandinavian countries. They judged that the way that they were handling data, and it may be that there is a way for the witnesses to do this that is compliant, because I don't know if there's a loophole or if there are certain, exemptions you can request, but they were found to be in violation of the current EU standards and the way they were doing it in Finland. So I'm assuming that when this goes EU-wide, that the basic way that most Jehovah's Witnesses take householder data will need to be either, well, at the very minimum, substantially modified to comply with whatever that law is. I'm assuming there are ways for people to gather data, because obviously it will still go on, but at the very minimum, I think they'll probably have to point blank ask for consent before they do it. But I guess we're going to see. Exactly. This is the interesting thing. It's whether or not they'll play the game.
Indeed.
Just really, really simply, the whole point of GDPR is to be transparent and completely open about what you're doing with people's data, and we know that that's not what is the case in the field service anyway. So like you said, I doubt that they're going to go ahead and be like, hey, here's a consent form to sign, because it's not in the nature to be transparent, really. So
Indeed. And that's what they're looking for, really, the authorities, is transparency. Another issue with the GDPR regulations, which we've identified, and this is something that John Redwood alluded to, is that it's made very clear in the notes to elders. So what Chloe read earlier was the form that witnesses are expected to sign. In the notes that are given to elders regarding those who refuse consent, here's what it says. I'll just bring up the relevant form for you. It says, if consent for the use of personal data is not provided, the affected individual may remain a publisher, baptized or unbaptized, and the congregation may keep his personal data related to his activity as a publisher, including the information recorded on the congregation's publisher record S21 card. However, the individual should be informed that the congregational branch office may not be able to evaluate his suitability to fill certain roles within the congregation or participate in many congregation activities, such as serving as a regular pioneer, a ministerial servant, or an elder. Now, you read that, Chloe, and you think, hang on a minute, we're talking about things that Jehovah's Witnesses are told they need to reach out for, and you need to be doing your very best as a Jehovah's Witness if you personally want to be judged favourably when Armageddon comes. So, for example, when it comes to your ministry, if your circumstances allow, you should be a regular pioneer. Here it's saying, guess what? We can't actually allow you to be a regular pioneer if you don't sign the consent form.
Which really is just another pressure point, isn't it? It's like, okay, they're asking me if they can store my data, but they're saying, if you don't let us, you can't have any of these things. And if you don't do any of these things, then you're probably not going to be looked on favourably. And if you're not looked upon favourably, then you're probably not going to have that many friends inside the organisation. If you don't have that many friends, and you're not a part of this whole brotherhood, are you really a witness? You know, are you going to get all, is Jehovah going to bless you like everybody else? Which is really, if you follow it through, that's how it would feel like unnecessary pressure. And also, part of what you just read confuses me slightly too, saying that they can still keep their data if they don't sign it. So that's kind of...
Yeah, which is interesting because by definition, if you refuse consent to Watchtower to keep your data, they shouldn't really be allowed, in my understanding. I mean, as someone who doesn't know the law very well, I can't see how they can be allowed to keep the publisher record cards, but they're telling elders continue to keep the publisher record cards regardless.
Yeah, and even if you're not looking at it from a legal standpoint and you're looking at it from an ethical standpoint, which, you know, Jehovah's Witnesses is supposed to be the most ethical, then you shouldn't be keeping that data anyway, because you're basically saying to someone, if you don't sign this, we can't keep your data, but then you keep it anyway. So if someone asked me that, I would assume that you're not keeping data unless I sign that.
So there's a whole, I think this is one of probably our, collectively, I think I speak for all of us, this is probably our biggest concern with the GDPR regulations, is that there are strings attached to saying no. And it cannot be true consent if there are penalties. Another example could be, what if you want to go to attend a special convention in another country? We're going to be looking at information later in this episode about a new system that Watchtower's bringing online, where that system will be used to process that kind of information. And again, that's an area in which you could potentially be penalised and not allowed to attend the convention.
And if you think, sorry,
after you, Chloe, after you.
If you think about this from a wider standpoint as well, GDPR is being implemented for usually service users of organizations. So, for instance, all the big tech companies and things like that. I've received a ton of GDPR emails recently from people that you're using their service and they want to keep you as a customer. So you can always opt out of using their service if it's a requirement for them and you don't want them to have your data, and that's fine. You have no repercussions in your whole life. Whereas this is very much like, if you don't sign this, then where does that leave you in life? This is not a service that's being used.
Yeah, following on from that point, I was just going to add that if someone is perhaps who's never been a Jehovah's Witness or is only vaguely aware of them is watching this because they're doing research on what this would have on for Jehovah's Witnesses. Imagine if this was, for example, a better known religion such as Catholicism, and the Catholic Church said, well, if you don't let us keep your data, you might not be able to get confession, and you might not have access to the Eucharist. You'll be able to come into church and you'll be able to sit there during Mass, but certain key aspects of your faith that you believe are essential for you to have a clean standing with God will not be available to you. That's the similar kind of situation that the witnesses will be in, that certain key aspects of their devotion to their religious faith won't be available to them, they're being told, unless they consent to have their data given. So if you are someone who has that faith, or you are someone who is in that, even if you don't believe it, if you are in that faith and trying to maintain a certain level of relationship with your family and friends, this is an extremely coercive practice.
Now, interestingly, I raised this point as well in my phone call to the Information Commissioner's office. And the lady said, it sounds like they're tying them up, was her expression. It's not freely given, is it? Meaning the consent, because they're trying to get consent on a precondition. No, they shouldn't be doing that. And that's when I just described what we're talking about now in a phone call to the local data protection authority.
And also, in a wider context in comparison to this, there's also a lot of work in the UK and EU based on making sort of like contracts and all that kind of thing in plain English so people can understand it. So if they're wrapping people up and tying them up in knots so that they have to stay in this, that's also not ethical. It's not really in line with the rest of the legislation that's going to follow in the coming years too. So.
Now, John, I know you added a few of your own concerns as regards medical records And you also raised a very interesting point about disfellowshipping.
Yes. Well, as far as the medical records, I find it extremely interesting that the new consent form, as well as the letter that was sent to the elders to read to the congregation and to read to themselves privately, has zero mention whatsoever of medical information. And I think most of our listeners will be well aware that Jehovah's Witnesses have a policy in which they request or require those who sign their medical directives to keep a copy of those medical directives on file with the congregation's secretary. Usually that means that they make a copy of that form, give it to the congregation secretary, and it would be kept in a filing cabinet at the Kingdom Hall. Not only does this, to me, seem to be a violation of privacy law, especially in the European Union here, which is going to effect in May, but also it may be a violation of HIPAA laws. And those HIPAA laws are quite strict. In fact, in the United States, and I'm sure in Europe as well, organizations can likewise be fined a very large amount of money in increments that get gradually higher and higher if they violate medical HIPAA laws regarding a person's information, any medical decisions or directives regarding their personal medical information. So I think it remains to be seen. My opinion would be that Watchtower has thought about this and that they have intentionally left it out of these documents so that they can come up with a solution to this, which, as Covert mentioned earlier, might be a loophole. But then we also have the issue of disfellowshipping. And whenever a person is disfellowshipped, the elders may throw away the notes from disfellowshipping, but they retain a form called an S-77 form, which is Notice of Disfellowshipping, and they send a copy to the branch office in whichever country they live in. So that begs the question, if a person is disfellowshipped and they have no intention on coming back to the organization, what happens when they request that their information be removed according to this new European Union law, GDPR law? So will Watchtower comply and remove the S-77 form from the documents, not only at the congregation level, but at the branch level? And if they do remove those documents, so this person is no longer on paper as a JW or former JW, then how will the organization deal with that person who walks into a Kingdom Hall and decides to go visit his family, or his brother-in-law is giving a talk? Is he still treated as a disfellowship person? And who is going to verify that, since that's no longer in writing? These are some questions that we don't have answers to yet, but we're hoping that some of our listeners will write in some of their thoughts and comments about these things, and we'll get more information as time goes on.
It's fascinating to think that if you do everything by the book and according to the principle of consent, then if someone refuses to sign one of these consent forms, in theory, it should be impossible to disfellowship them, because how can you write an S-77 form with all their details if they've not given you permission to do that? So
I really think that a greater point that we have to look at here in general is, what is a religion doing for a person? Is it doing something spiritually beneficial? When you have to sign documents and forms, what we're learning from all of this is that it ties a person's spirituality to a piece of paper.
Yeah.
As Jehovah's Witnesses are, they're told that a spiritual person will pioneer, reach out to become a ministerial servant or an elder, but these forms make it clear that those things won't happen if a person does not sign this piece of paper. So therefore, their spirituality, their view in their reputation in the congregation is tied to this consent form.
Indeed. Yeah. And actually in the consent form, which Chloe read earlier, it's worth stressing that point that you've just made, John. It says, additionally, I consent to the use of my personal data so that I may participate in some religious activities in connection with my worship, and so that I may receive spiritual support, the implication being that spiritual support is contingent on signing the consent form, which is not free consent.
it's really disturbing, and I think that it's going to affect other religions as well. I had a discussion earlier today with a couple of former Mormons, and they told me that their organization, and this was surprising to me, but their organization that they used to belong to also collects data on individuals, and that this is becoming an issue for the Mormon Church as well. And I think likely we're going to see it with other organizations, and perhaps some of our listeners can write in if they used to be member of the Catholic Church or some other organizations. Maybe they have some insight. But it clearly is data collection. It's going on for Mormons as well.
Although, interestingly, I raised this issue with the Information Commissioner's office, and she said, I have spoken to a lot of religions recently. This sounds different. The other ones seem to have got it on board, and they don't actually hold as much information, or if they do, it's on explicit consent, and there are no preconditions. So obviously you need to listen to the recording, and again, I can't play the recording, but it was very noticeable that she seemed taken aback at the sheer volume of information that witnesses require.
And just a point I just wanted to mention on what you said earlier, John, around disfellowshipping. So before, I knew people kept lots of records, and it was sent between congregations, and that's how you would find out if someone was disfellowshipped. If they just walked in off the street and just said they were a new person, a new publisher, they wouldn't be able to do that because of all the records that are held. In other religions, they don't shun. So if they're not trying to control people, there's no reason for them to have to get people to sign these consent forms. Like, you can walk into a Catholic church and you can go talk to a priest about problems if you want to. There are no conditions, and he doesn't need to know where you live or any of that information before he gives you advice from the Bible if that's what you wanted. So
it's a great point, Chloe. I think it's going to call into question how people view religion and what control those religions should have over their personal lives and their personal information, because this is the first time we have seen this level of interest by the government in the affairs of a religious organization, and it's in the form of privacy policy. And I really give it to the European community for bringing this to the attention of all of these groups, because it will affect. This is going to have long-term implications on what a religion can do and what they can't do.
Don't you also think it's interesting that GDPR is not mentioned in this consent form? Because every single email I've received from any tech companies that have told me that by the 25th of May they're going to be compliant, and if I want to see anything I can look at it, that's not mentioned at all, which is very interesting. They're not being transparent on that again.
Yeah, there's an announcement. We do have access to the wording. It just says, beginning May 25th, 2018, a new law regarding the use of personal data will take effect. So they don't name the law, they just say there's a new law coming in.
I think Chloe brings up a really good point, too, because that form that she read doesn't mention the GDPR. And I believe one reason could be that the Jehovah's Witness organization intends to use this in other countries that are not covered by the GDPR, because that's a very European set of laws. If they were to use this in the United States, GDPR would be irrelevant because we're not under the EU. Yeah. So I believe that they have a greater plan for this consent form, and perhaps that we'll get into that a little bit more with this new program that we're going to be discussing in a bit.
There's just one final point I thought might be worth making, and I'll be very quick, and it's not too much of a detour, but sometimes people refer to Jehovah's Witnesses as Orwellian, and Orwell often wrote about the dangers of societies that become very controlling of their citizens. One of the fascinating things is if you look at some of the most repressive regimes on the planet that have existed or that exist now, the Soviet Union, for example, was famous for its bureaucracy, for its intense, and all the other kind of communist and even the fascist regimes. The more a regime wants to control its citizens, the more data it takes over, the more records it has, the more bureaucracy it has. And it's interesting to note again that the consistency seems to be that the more complex and in-depth and invasive the bureaucracy, the more the desire for control in that organization seems to be. It's a bit of a side point, which I thought it was probably just worth flagging up, given how what Watchtower does is often referred to as Orwellian. And this is another aspect of the kind of behavior that George Orwell famously warned about in some of his books.
Well, if viewers are in any doubts as to whether the organization is Orwellian, hopefully those doubts will be assuaged when we look at the clips that we're going to show you now, because having dealt with we were at first a little bit confused as to how to deal with all this, because we have the GDPR regulations, which again are coming into force in May, but we also have at JW Survey knowledge of a new system that is being implemented by Watchtower that will take effect globally, and this system is called Publisher ID, and we know about this because of a video that was leaked by an insider. Again, we're not going to go into any details as to who leaked it or how, but we can share with you a few clips from this video. Now, just by way of a disclaimer, this is one of the most boring videos I've ever seen from Watchtower, and that's saying a lot. But I have selected 4 relevant clips that will let you know what this new system is and what it's for. And we're going to take a look at the first clip now.
Well, thank you very much, brothers, for coming. Recently, the governing body approved a project we call Publisher ID. And essentially, what this does is means that we'll keep track of all the publishers inside of Hub. And that would also mean that the publishers' record cards could be kept electronically on jw.org by the congregation elders. And it could open up several possibilities for things that we really can't do well today because we don't know who the publishers are. It isn't exactly that every publisher is going to have a login. It just means that they have a publisher ID and we have some basic information about them. And it is confidential at this point, so we're explaining to you a little bit what we're doing. You may wonder why we're explaining what we're doing. Is because so many committees are involved with the different projects when it comes to publisher data. So certainly coordinators committee, service committee, and personnel committee have deep involvement in wanting to have applications, for example, for someone in the field to turn in an application. Well, we don't know who that person is. They have to go through the congregation secretary, et cetera. And you'll see a little bit in Francois' demonstration explanation a little bit later how that works. But we also thought that several of the other committees are working on projects that may involve publishers in the field. And we thought it would be good for you also to know what the governing body had approved and how that may fit in with projects that you are working on for the future as well. And for some of you, it may have no impact on what you're doing, but it may be just good for you to know because it's going to impact the congregations and the elders as time goes along. So Brother Francois Lowe is going to give about a 20-minute presentation on what it involves. I'm going to give a few comments at the end, and then we have also a chance to answer some questions that you may have on it. We may not be able to answer all of them, but we could try and answer a few of them. All right? Brother Francois?
Okay, very good. So we'd like to just take you through some of the reasoning that led us to this project. There was a project team put together with brothers from Service Committee Office, Personnel Committee Office, Coordinators Committee Office, and also the World Headquarters Computer Department that had a look at the need for this project, which we're calling Publisher ID. So why do we feel we need to have a Publisher ID, a digital identity for every publisher in the organization? Well, what we hope that this presentation will show you is that this project ends up reducing the work of the congregation secretary, which is an important consideration. We hope to also reduce the work of the branch office, and we'll hopefully show you why. We hope to reduce the work of the circuit overseer, the busiest brothers in the organization in the field, and hopefully we're less likely to lose track of important information related to publishers in the organization. And we also hope to make sure that publisher identification data is stored more securely than it is right now. And we'll have a look at how congregation secretaries are working today and why we feel that this project achieves that.
So, what a fascinating clip. I think this just helps to establish what it is that Watchtower is doing and some of their motivations behind it. But Cova, one thing that kind of really stood out to me was that when they were listing the benefits of the new publisher ID system, nowhere did it mention, well, we're doing this to help the brothers, we're doing this so that we can fulfill our duties to them better. All of the benefits were organizationally oriented. So they were talking about the congregation secretary, the branch office, the CO, and they were talking about being able to manage their data better. Nothing about the actual ordinary publisher.
Yeah, it's kind of clear that what they're doing is essentially trying to streamline their workload. And I can imagine, because if they have, as we've said, the organization's very bureaucratic. There's forms to fill in for virtually everything. I mean, I know from personal experience that some elders do very little, but some elders and some COs and I can imagine some other organization members are just snowed under completely. So this isn't being done because we think, as you say, we think it'll help the brothers, serve the brothers better. Although it's interesting to see how, whilst the notice for consent that Chloe read said, well, you'll need this to get spiritual support and help in religious activities. That's not apparently the motive that's said in this internal. They don't say anywhere this is going to help us help the brothers. This is purely about streamlining the bureaucratic process. And that was an interesting contrast I thought up. So either they've added that stuff in about spirituality to put more pressure on the average JW to consent, and so that their workload is easier, so that they can implement this process. But judging from this entire video, and you made me watch all 30 minutes of it, I was eating amphetamine-laced popcorn by the end of that, just to stay awake.
I'm sadistic like that, I'm afraid.
Yeah, nowhere in this video is that the whole thing is all about how is this going to aid our organization. It's not about this is going to help us aid the brothers spiritually. So there's an interesting little disconnect between what they're telling the brothers and sisters and what they're actually saying in the conference call.
And chillingly, John, we've moved from an issue that affects witnesses living in European countries. We're now talking about all Jehovah's Witnesses. So this is now something that even the large majority of our viewers who are in America and indeed non-European countries should be concerned about.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, we were discussing this a little bit earlier. I don't know if Jehovah's Witnesses in general realize just how much bureaucracy there is in these electronic departments that have been formed and approved by the publishing committee, the governing bodies committees. One of the programs that they have administered in the past year to 2 years is called HUB, H-U-B. And what that is, it's a program of electronic or computerized modules that allow the governing body and the organization team leaders to govern information in all sorts of different departments, whether it's information for managing publishers, managing elders, managing the School for Kingdom Evangelizers. They have every one of these modules underneath of this entire hub program, and it's all permission-based. So the higher up you are in the system, the more permissions you will be granted to access certain things. And that would include the legal department, even things such as child abuse documentation, files that were sent in to Watchtower. Those things are all part of their giant database of information that is being stored. So the HUB program is really the master program in this new publisher ID, is one of the modules of that program. And as you said in your comment, this is global. This is not just in the European Union, but they've made it clear in the videos that we've watched that they want all of their records management and publisher identification information to be stored globally. And for those who are familiar with databases, you might refer to a key piece of information in a database as the database key. So they call this publisher ID because every single Jehovah's Witness is now just a number. You're just a number. And anything to do with your activities, you're going to an assembly, you're going appointed as a ministerial servant, pioneer, you're disfellowshipped. All of this is tied to your identification number in their database. So again, it really, to me, just dehumanizes what most people believe is true Christianity, and it turns it into a large bureaucratic combination of numbers, letters, and binary bits of information. It certainly is not what most people would believe Jesus intended.
Go therefore and put everyone on a massive Orwellian database.
What's interesting
Indeed.
too is when they said that not everybody would have a login, but everybody would have an entry. And on systems, like I work with a lot of systems, and everybody who is in the system has a login, because now they have to be able to download any information you're storing on them. So you could just go in and just print it off right away, and you know exactly what's being stored. And that's the same with, like, the big dogs that I've had recently.
Yeah, there is a fairly chilling implication as well to the fact that not every publisher has a login, which we'll come to. But perhaps we should get on and play clip number 2.
So that's the issue that we have. So how much data do we have in Hub? Well, let's take the United States as an example. Just over 1,200,000 publishers. About 1,250,000 publishers. Now, of that number of publishers in the United States branch territory, how many already have a record in Hub? Well, it's about half. It's about 750,000 persons. And remember that we have low confidence in about a third of that data, and high confidence in about 2/3 of that data. So the reality is we're already storing just over half of our publishers worldwide. We have some record of their existence, but we have low confidence in a fairly large percentage of that data. So how do we correct this issue? What is the answer? We feel that it is allowing entry of the S21, that's the Congregation's Publisher Record Card, on jw.org. And why do we feel that that's beneficial? Well, let's just first look at perhaps a couple of concerns. Does this mean that every publisher needs to create their own login on jw.org? Is that what we're suggesting? The answer is no, not everyone. We're not expecting that the 85-year-old faithful pioneer sister in the congregation is going to have to go and create her own login for jw.org. And we also recognize that in many parts of the world, there's still limited internet bandwidth and availability, and so we're certainly not considering that this is a global solution. What we are hoping to accomplish, though, is that we have a verification process for every publisher involving the congregation secretary. And so instead of the secretary having to sort of decide, do you already have a publisher identity somewhere or not? Do you have a login or not? Are those two connected or not? We have a standard organizational process to verify the digital identity of every publisher, and we're trying to make that easy for the congregation secretary. And hopefully the result of this is that of all of the publishers we have, for example, in the United States branch, we would have every publisher's identity available in Hub, and we would have high confidence in the accuracy of the data of every publisher in the organization.
So I don't know whether you caught that, but chillingly, probably you're watching this. You could be watching this as a Jehovah's Witness thinking, well, at least it's still going to happen in the future and it's not necessarily something that's happening now. And yes, this is something that's being brought in the future. We're going to talk about the timescale in a little bit more detail, but we've just heard that already half of all United States publishers or Jehovah's Witnesses have their information stored electronically.
Yeah, that's a great point, Lloyd. That really this tells witnesses that they've been collecting their information for quite some time, and that they're tired of having all these separate databases of information. They would like to combine it into one centralized database where they can access this information from anywhere in the world, from any of their data centers. So, for example, for many years, as most witnesses know, there was a regional building committee, and that regional building committee existed throughout the world, and they had their own unique organized structure. Later, that was integrated into a computer program that was built by the society, by the Watchtower organization, and that was called Builder Assist. Builder Assist was a database in which anyone who had anything to do with data was entered into the system. And I can tell you from personal knowledge that I had access to one of the overseers of that department. I had access to his login, and I saw all of the data that was in that, and it was extensive. It was, and by the way, this was just in one regional part of the United States. And when I looked at the records, there were close to 3,000 records just from one state, including the names, addresses, phone numbers, elder, ministerial servant, pioneer, date of their baptism, date of their birth. All of this information I saw with my own eyes, and anyone could export that data at any time into an Excel spreadsheet file and pass it on to anyone else. So what they've done is they've got all these different pockets of data that they want to integrate into one system. And so that's why they were talking about some of the data not being reliable, is because they have these various, the School for Kingdom Evangelizers, the RBC, which is now the LDC, and all of these different things where they've been collecting data, and they believe that some of that data is accurate and some of it may be out of date. But they want the congregation secretary to be, the key man in updating publishers' data, so that he can control whether or not a person has been added as a pioneer or deleted as a ministerial servant. And then they would consider that information from the congregation secretary as reliable information. So then they would have high confidence in that. So very, very controlled manner of putting publisher data into a global database. And by the way, as I understand it now from one of our insiders, Watchtower has 3 primary data centers. One is in New York, one is in Japan, and one is in the Netherlands. And these are large data centers where all of this information is being stored permanently, so that if one data center goes down, any branch official or elder or anyone in the world who has access will automatically access that data from one of the other 2 existing data centers. So they've put a tremendous amount of thought into this global data program.
Indeed. I'm just, it's, you don't, when you join the religion, you never consider that this is how your personal information will be used. So I can only imagine those listening, hearing that figure, half of all American Jehovah's Witnesses are already on our system. I personally find that quite chilling. I do, however, think we need to crack on with these clips. So let's listen to clip number 3.
Now, the big question is, are there legal concerns? So when we first showed this slide to our brothers in the legal department, they just started laughing. Of course, there are some concerns. However, some benefits are that our data is securely stored, so we can make sure that our data is stored in the most secure fashion available. The reality is we already are doing this for 50% of the publishers in the organization, so we're just extending the number of publishers we're already storing their information for. And then the principle that we're working with the legal department on is the principle of informed consent. And so that's really the legal basis for us to be able to do this. So although there are legal concerns, we're able to address all of those. And so hopefully you've been able to see from this brief presentation that our Publisher ID project does end up reducing the work of the congregation secretary, the branch office, the circuit overseer, and we're sure to not lose track of important information. And we will also be storing this publisher identification data much more securely than we are storing it now. This has a lot of potential future benefits, this project. What about a midweek meeting schedule? What about congregation duty assignments, cleaning schedules, emergency contact information for publishers in the congregation, an outgoing speakers list, public talk scheduling within a circuit, and so on? All of these tools for congregation elders become possible once we have a solid basis with our publisher identification data. So that's our benefit. Question is, when should we expect this? Well, knowing that this is the groundwork for 13 approved projects, we've been told by the Coordinators Committee to give this priority. And so the World Headquarters Computer Department is already actively working on this. But we feel it's about 8 months of work for the basics, which we plan to start in earnest in September of 2017. And this is being built as part of what we call the Central Data Hub. And we're very happy to arrange for a technical discussion for any of the technical departments represented here. I think MEPS, we've already shown you our Central Data Hub architecture. But if anybody else would like a technical discussion, we're happy to provide more details about that. And that is it for me. Thank you very much, brothers.
So, there were some interesting takeaways from that clip. First of all, in terms of timescale, I mentioned earlier that this is a future project, but it's not that far in the future, because we're assuming that this video, well, it had to have been filmed either in late 2016 or at some point in 2017. But when they're talking about the timescale for Publisher ID, they say it will last 8 months. It will begin in September 2017. And 8 months from September 2017 takes us to May 2018, which interestingly coincides with the GDPR deadline that we were talking about earlier.
I was just
Yeah, and there's also this. They almost kind of laugh at the fact that there are, legal considerations. They say, oh, well, the legal department just laughed when we asked them about that. And they said everything's fine so long as there's informed consent. But again, Covert, how can you have informed consent when people feel as though if they don't sign, there will be ramifications?
Well, this is exactly the point. Under those circumstances, you can't have informed consent. You have coercion. As a quick side point, I think their trust in the legal department is sorely misplaced, given how the legal department have performed in various courts and royal inquiries across the world the past few years. Maybe everything starts to make sense now. But exactly, there's a key. This appears to be the key thing that I think they honestly haven't realised. Is they're basing this, it's okay, as long as we get informed consent, we're fine. And they don't realize how coercive their behavior is. Because again, in the letter that Chloe read out, they essentially put your spiritual support and spiritual activities as being congregant on you signing this form. Now, in the EU, as we've already heard, if they try to, they actually say in there, and I agree to have my data passed to other countries. So in other words, looks like it's setting up for this data to be streamed into Publisher ID. But we've already heard that on that, the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, has already said, based upon looking at that letter, that they can't do this. This is not consent. So they're going to have real problems on the basis of that letter trying to stream this data into Publisher ID, because I strongly suspect that if it comes to a legal challenge, they're going to have problems in the EU with the wording of this current consent form. And I don't know what the principles are in the US, but I suspect that an informed judge and an informed solicitors would be able to prove that there was coercion upon American JWs to sign this form. And in a way, it's going to sound like I'm cutting them a bit of slack, and I'm not really. I honestly think that they do think they're getting informed consent, because I know this is often debated, and I respect that there are good reasons to disagree with me on this. But I do believe that most of the time they don't realize how manipulative and controlling they are, because manipulative and controllingness is something only bad people do, and we're just helping the brothers to understand what's right for them, and we're just helping the brothers to walk the right path. when you're on the outside looking in, it's so obvious that this is the key misunderstanding that they're working on. But in their head, I'm absolutely convinced they genuinely think that there's absolutely no problem here, and they can't see the pitfall.
And also, it's really not informed consent, because it doesn't say we're going to store your data in a global database with everybody else. What it does say is it could potentially go to a different country that has lower data protection security in place, which is also, it's not really acceptable for a legal document either, because you have to know for GDPR where the data is going to be stored.
It's like a blank check, isn't it?
So for us, for example, we would say, hey, all of your data is stored on servers here in this physical location. That's what you have to do. So it's really ambiguous. It doesn't even look like a legal document to me at all. It doesn't look like informed consent.
Indeed. I'm just hoping that among the many who will be watching this video, one or two will be legal experts who will be picking their jaws up off the floor and saying, I know exactly how to deal with this situation. But moving on, let's take our final clip from the Publisher ID video.
We have a few minutes. I didn't know if some of you had any questions. We'd be happy to. Yeah.
For you, Francois. So you mentioned that the publisher ID does not necessarily equal a login on jw.org. So if I was a publisher and I go to jw.org and want to enter an application, does that require a login?
It does require a login, and having your ID available to the secretary makes it much easier for him to connect your.
So for some publishers, or actually, I mean, it will increase the number of logins then on jw.org.
Yes. So the question was, does it mean then that if you wanted to fill out an application, you need the publisher has to have a login? And that's correct. You would. In the case, though, we're just not making it a requirement that everyone who has a publisher ID or a publisher card has to have a login. But if they want to do something that involves maybe communicating with the branch office, then it would be good if they got a login. And so that the number of logins is going to go up, and the number of publishers that have logins go up. But we didn't want you to equate the publisher ID and publisher card with having to have a login. They're not one and the same. Everybody will have a publisher ID and will know about them, but only people who really need to will have a login. Does that make sense? Because otherwise it can seem a bit daunting to require everybody to have a login. That's right.
The data will only be as good as the initial entry that's made by the secretary. I've never seen a congregation publisher card file box that was correct and up to date. Every card, every data point. Baptism dates are often missing. Birth dates sometimes incorrect. The spelling of the name is not correct. How are we going to manage this with the secretaries entering all this data so it's accurate?
Yeah, Brother Stranko asked, how are we going to make sure that the data for the publishers is accurate? Because he said he hadn't seen a box of cards that was totally accurate. One is we could stress to the secretaries that it's more important now to get the data and keep the data up to date. And maybe because now on jw.org, they'll be using that data in their lists and other features of the program for like emergency contact information, that it'll be more clear that the date is that when it sits on the card and doesn't get used by anything, it may not be important for the brother to keep it up to date. And I think we've also talked about the possibility, there's the possibility then for publishers with a login to keep their own information up to date. So there'd be certain things that we wouldn't let them change about the publisher record card, but their address, telephone number, their basic contact information, we could now allow people to maintain it themselves and make sure it's accurate. So that could also be a future possibility down the line.
So, Chloe, you raised this point earlier about the publisher ID having, obviously familiarized yourself with it already, the video that is. And that's the point that publisher ID system has all of these records for all of the different Jehovah's Witnesses, but that doesn't mean that each of the people on the system have a login. In other words, a good number, probably a majority even, of people who are having their information stored on the system will have no way of getting to it. And what's interesting is that he says there'll be some things that they wouldn't be allowed to change even if they did have a login to the system, which again raises this whole issue of you're harvesting this information and you're keeping records about people that you're not allowing them any control over.
Oh, yeah, which goes against the whole point of this law. So it kind of unties it in one sentence when he says that, and I was just shaking my head when I was listening to it, because it's not the transparency that this law is looking for. And also the way he tells them kind of put me off a little bit too. The way he tries to say, oh, that dear old sister, we wouldn't make her log in, and someone else who has technical difficulties, we wouldn't make them log in, as if it's for their own good and they're doing them a favor. It's nothing to do with that, really, when you think about it. They just don't want everybody to have a login, because it's going to be extra pressure on their servers and departments, to all of that kind of stuff, of people trying to log in and do all those kinds of things. And also it's going to be way more transparent about what data is being held about each individual. So they're not doing this for the transparency of the law, really. So
Kova, it would be a bit different. I mean, obviously Facebook has had its own issues in this regard, but it would be a little bit different if witnesses could at least see what information is being stored about them and control which information they want to be stored or kept private.
Yeah, there's something that comes to mind that links into one of the other ongoing kind of JW news stories here, is that we know that Reclaimed Voices in the Netherlands have been campaigning to get Watchtower to turn over to abuse victims the records that Watchtower stores of those abuse victims. And Watchtower initially refused. And apparently things have, there'll be a JW survey article going up in the next couple of weeks on this, because since then there have been some updates. Essentially, if you read the newspaper articles that have come out, the government's kind of started to put a bit of pressure on, and Watchtower has suddenly started to change its tune. But initially, the attitude from Watchtower was very much, no, this is our data. They literally said, this is our data. What's your legal basis for demanding access to it? These are abuse victims asking Watchtower to provide the records that they have on these abuse victims and their own abuse. And this highlights the attitude that is probably the same institutional attitude under which this database is being constructed. Or what right do you have to know what information we have on you? We're God's holy organization. You are God's people. We will take whatever information we like, and you'll say, thank you, sir. And so this is a case of, I think, it's an institutional attitude which underscores a lot of what Watchtower does. And this isn't just another example of them not feeling the need to be transparent, not feeling the need to be accountable, and not wanting to surrender any kind of control to the people who are on the bottom rungs, because Watchtower is very top down. Decisions get made at the top. The people at the bottom shouldn't have any control. They just do what they're told. And if you start giving the publishers control and access over all of their data, and he actually says, we're not going to do that. There's some things in there we're not going to let them change. As soon as, it again highlights the underlying attitude that Watchtower has towards things generally, but specifically in the way they handle data and information upon people. Yeah.
Can I just say one thing too, which kind of just struck me whilst you were talking, was that so Apple have already updated all of their GDPR regulations in their software and everything, and it says that each time that they're going to be using your personal data for any reason, it will show you each time, and it makes you consent every time. So it's a continuous consent process, not a one-time signature, in the past, and then it's good for any data to be used, which I just thought was important to this, because it's one blanket form when other corporations don't really work like that either.
There's lots of scope for it to be done in a far more transparent way. I guess if I'm summing up my concerns with the Publisher ID video, as I did with the GDPR regulation or Watchtower's dealing with that whole issue, it would be, first of all, that half of all American Jehovah's Witnesses currently have their personal information stored electronically. Are they all aware of this, and has full consent been given? I doubt it. It's also that, as we mentioned, the fact that the benefits of the publisher ID system are organization-centric and focused on streamlining the workflows. They're not aimed at helping ordinary Jehovah's Witnesses. We've mentioned that not all Jehovah's Witnesses will have logins, and even those that do will have limited ability to control their information. Also, could the publisher ID system be merged with the legal department records so that it is holding information that should be acted on by law enforcement? If you watch the whole video, it's clear that they are considering the potential for other aspects of Watchtower's data keeping requirements to be merged with the publisher ID system. Also, what recourse is there for removing or deleting records? We have what's called the right to be forgotten. How does someone who finds their way onto this monstrous database get themselves off it? And finally, the huge potential for abuse of the system so that personal information is used against publishers, i.e., again, if you watch the video, it's talking about the report slips that are handed to the secretary every month to indicate how many hours the publisher has done. How does this system impact the penalties if people fail to report? In other words, is Watchtower more easily able to penalise publishers or flag publishers that drift into inactivity with very grave consequences on their lives? So I guess those are my concerns, and I'm mindful of the fact that we've been talking for some time now. So I think now would be a good moment to do Covert Fade introduces the news, and then after that we'll maybe do a summary of what our thoughts are as regards the GDPR fiasco and publisher ID. So without further ado, let's introduce Covert Fade introduces the news.
And cue music. So here we go. So as I understand it, they let some talentless amateur read my news last time.
Yeah, sorry
and
about
I
that. We've
an
sacked
official
him.
letter of complaint.
We've sacked him.
You know.
Yeah.
That hurts. That hurts. Over. I'm sorry. We're no longer friends.
We're done. We're done.
You're disfellowshipped.
We didn't even ask for his consent. We just sacked him. But
I know, it was just terrible.
Yeah.
To be honest, I
do you have papers, Covert? Do you look like a real newsman? I want to see you shuffling papers, right?
Well, that's why I had to come back and do it this time. I was terrified for my position. I thought if they let John Redwood read it again, I'm toast. So I've got to come back and defend my position here.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's hear the news.
Okay, here we go. So actually, we're going to start off. We've been dealing with some fairly kind of like complex and also / worrying, depressing stuff. So I thought we'd change tack a little bit with something absolutely fantastic. So those of you who've been reading XJW's survey, or you've been following Lloyd's channel, or you've generally been kind of in the XJW community these past couple of weeks, will know that there's actually a film project underway called XJW. The director is a guy called Scott Homan, who's sort of come out of the Jehovah's Witness faith himself. And he's putting together, him and his team are putting together they want to put together a series of videos that document the experience of people leaving. And it's very much focused on that. It's very much focused on what's it like to leave and, then come out into the world. And Scott wants to capture the kind of that spirit and that adventurousness of those who leave the faith and who rebuild their lives outside. Now, he had this project, obviously, because this is going to cost a lot of money to produce. So Scott wanted to crowdfund this project, and he put it on Seed and Spark. And the goal was they had to get $9,000 and 1,000 followers within, I think it was about 30 days, about a month's time. I'm very happy to announce that as of tonight, they have 3 days left. They have beaten their target by $3,000, and they have also beaten their follower target. So that's fantastic. So what that means is, A, this documentary is going to get funded, and B, because they got over 1,000 followers, they're eligible to apply for some grants that are anywhere in the region of between $25,000 and $50,000. And potentially those grants also come with thousands of dollars worth of filmmaking equipment and producing expertise. So this is absolutely fantastic news. I'm really looking forward to see what comes out of this project. And I'm so happy for Scott and his team because, and also I'm so proud of the XJW community for coming together and making this happen. And also a huge thank you because I suspect not everyone who supported was an XJW. I saw a number of Twitter accounts I follow. I know Alex O'Connor, Cosmic Skeptic,
even
retweeted.
Barack Obama apparently is following him on Twitter.
Yeah, I saw that. So hey, there you go. Former presidential seal of approval. Barack Obama backs XJW. So that's the first thing I just wanted to cover. If you want to follow the project, you can go to seedandspark.com. You can go to xjw.com, or you can follow them on Twitter. But that's some really good news. Secondly, I thought we'd go on to leaks because we've been talking about a lot of leaks. And in a way, this whole episode we're doing is kind of down to information that was leaked. Well, we had quite an interesting leak, which if you've been covering watching Lloyd's channel, you already know about. The July, yes, I did say July JW Broadcasting episode is now leaked. So clearly this is a case of Jehovah's channel providing food at the proper time. What I found fascinating about this, I mean, if you haven't already seen the rebuttal, check it out because it's kind of typical JW Broadcasting, really. There's bits that you'll cringe at, bits that you'll yell at the screen at, and bits that you'll laugh at. But the thing I found interesting is, one, it's fascinating to see how far in advance they make these. Because these rebuttals, because sometimes you think, well, did they make them like a week in advance, a day in advance? Well, no. Like most production companies, there's actually quite a long ramp-up time. It takes a long time to get, even something as cringeworthy and tacky as JW Broadcasting, it takes a long time to get it together and out of the can. So I found it, A, quite interesting that they're made that far in advance, and B, as I think I tweeted out at the time, dear Watchtower, if you want people to stop leaking your videos, maybe let people leave with decency. If they were to just let people leave with dignity, I think they'd find that so many of these embarrassing leaks and inside problems go away. And the last item of news I'd just like to move on to is it's another leak, because we've got we can watch the July JW Broadcasting in advance, and now we've already had some of this material leaked, and we've already been able to see it. But if you go to the website faithleaks.org, and you're curious about the 2018 regional convention, you can now watch the videos, you can now read the talks, you can read fascinating talks that have the titles like Courage Weakeners versus Courage Strengtheners, Despair versus Hope, Courage Weakeners versus Courage Strengtheners, Unwholesome Recreation versus Field Ministry. My money's on unwholesome recreation. You can also look at the risks and rewards of Hannah, Michelle, Azaniah, Aquila, and Priscilla. You can look at Stephen. Basically, the whole thing has very much a tone of be courageous and strong, but horrible things are coming. So I've already looked through some of the material and can confirm there's a whole lot of fear-mongering coming your way if you're a Jehovah's Witness attending the 2018 convention.
But will it be the worst convention ever, we ask? Because I'll have to rebrand my...
I know. I would love it to be. I still think that the 2016 convention takes the biscuit just because of the sheer bat poop craziness of the bunker videos and the shunning video especially. I mean, to see them... There's some crazy stuff in the 2018 convention. You've already covered a little bit, and we've seen other bits of it popping up. That still isn't anything that quite hits the crazy level of 2016. But the whole thing is very much about fear mongering, and there's an entire section about future events, including the attack of Gog of Magog and the proclamation of the Hailstone message. So, yeah, it's not exactly cuddles and fluffy candy floss.
Well, that was a very capably handled episode of Covert Fade Introduces the News. So thank you, Covert Fade, and commiserations to John Redwood, who has lost his crown, but filled in ably when we needed him to, and hopefully will again if we call upon him. But let's go back to this whole thing with data, because I think it's safe to say that this is a complicated issue. We've done our best, again, without being experts, to just kind of present to you what the situation is and what our concerns are. John, what do you think? I mean, again, we started by talking about people emailing in to JW Survey, so clearly there is already concern from those who are attending meetings or who are related to people who are attending meetings. What do you think our advice is or should be to people who are presented with this form?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Lloyd. This is an area where people have to ask themselves, do I wish to submit my personal information to an organization that really doesn't tell me what they're doing with that information? And I think Chloe brought it out a little bit very, very concisely earlier when she mentioned the fact that it's not just the fact that the data is being given to Watchtower, but they're not telling you exactly what they're doing with it, where it's being stored, and it's not an ongoing process. You sign this form one time. We don't know if witnesses are going to be asked to sign this again every year. We just don't know. But I think the question for every Jehovah's Witness to ask themselves is, do I feel comfortable? Do I really trust this organization and what they're doing with my data? And do I trust myself with what I do with other people's data? Because if I'm a Jehovah's Witness, I'm doing cart witnessing ministry, I'm knocking on doors, I'm writing down someone's personal name, their address, what their daughter's name is. All of this is very personal information. And I think it was mentioned earlier that the witnesses in the UK and in Finland and other countries have gotten themselves in trouble because of using that house-to-house record, which in many cases they can't do anymore. So all of this raises a lot of questions I think people need to ask themselves. Do I really feel comfortable with turning my data over? It reminds me of something that happened to me about 6 years ago. When I was in the organization, I went to the Kingdom Hall, and our Kingdom Hall was hosting an RBC event where everyone was updating their regional building committee information, and we were getting photo IDs taken. In fact, I have my photo ID right here in this room. So what they did was they took our photos and they showed an application of my RBC application, which was a piece of paper. And they had a sister hand it to me, slide it across the table, and said, "Can you please verify your information?" So it's my name, my address, all my personal information. And I started to turn the form over. And she took her hand and she put it down and said, "Stop, you can't do that." Because on the reverse side of the paper were the elders' private comments about me.
Wow.
And there wasn't anything negative said about me, but I was not allowed, and even she was not allowed. She was told that I am not allowed to turn that piece of paper over and look at the data that's on the other side, which is elders' comments about, how I work with others, how I'm doing in my assignment, how qualified I am in that assignment. But she put her hand down, stopped, and she grabbed and pulled that paper back because she was given those instructions to not let me see that data. That's my data. That's information that's written about me. And this happens in every application that Jehovah's Witnesses sign. If you sign up for the School for Kingdom Evangelizers, if you sign up to go to a convention, just an innocuous convention in Finland or Italy, or, Jehovah's Witnesses love their conventions, but you have to fill out a convention and the elders have to write information about you on your application form. You will never, ever see that information. That is hidden from you the same way my regional building committee information was hidden from me. Only the elders can see that and the organization can see that. So they're taking all of this data and they're collecting it. much of which you have no idea that they're collecting, and they're sending it to this centralized hub database system known as Publisher ID. And it's all going to be on data servers in Japan, the Netherlands, and Warwick, New York, so that they can keep track of all of this and, quote unquote, make it easier for the secretary to organize his data. So it's, as we said earlier, it's very Orwellian, it's very scary, and I think we should all question it.
Covert, it feels very much as though what we're witnessing here is a collision between this religion that has evolved over the decades to be heavily, or we could say overly, reliant on harvesting information to which it's mostly not entitled. And it's colliding with the modern age, especially in Europe, which with its sophisticated rules that it has developed regarding data protection. And I'm fascinated to see what the fallout is.
I'm really fascinated because I completely agree. What we've got here is exactly as you describe, and we've got the added layer on top of an organization that's been coercing its followers for a long, long time, not realizing it's about to blunder into a law that prevents that kind of coercion in this legal sphere, in this specific legal area. I'm really fascinated because what they're trying to spin up is a situation whereby if you want to be a full Jehovah's Witness who's completely participating of all of your religious duties, you kind of have to be on this database. And if you're not on this database, you won't be able to do certain things. You're going to get leaned on. There could be some essential coercion, even if they don't think it is. Versus one part of the world, i.e. the European Union, that is absolutely now going to not stand for that if it finds out about it. And a kind of a wider general, it feels like at the moment with like Facebook and all the other controversies, it feels like there's a wider awareness coming into both the public and the law about how this data can be used and how consent for the use of this data can be obtained. Now, I'm not a legal expert. I don't know where this goes. I don't know if there are ways for Watchtower to obtain legally the loopholes that it needs. But it's clear that on the surface that the way they are going about obtaining their consent for this data inside the EU does not appear to be compliant with EU law. And the potential penalties for this not being compliant are quite large. And I think, so I don't know where it's going to go. I suspect there is going to be quite an interesting collision because I can't see how they're going to be able to keep it under wraps. And the only thing I would say is obviously each individual Jehovah's Witness has to decide what they want to do about it if they're not happy with it. But they should know that actually the EU law is on their side. Mm-hmm. And if Watchtower does anything to you because you don't want to sign that form, the legal hellstorm they could be unleashing upon themselves could be huge. I can't say that for definite, but it certainly seems that you should pick what you do carefully. But I would certainly contact whatever legal entity is in your country that deals with this and tell them your story, because I suspect you'll find that you've got a far more powerful ally than you think you have in terms of the EU and the law in this case.
And in fact, while we're on that subject, I neglected to mention earlier that I will be putting a link in the description below. I was originally going to give you the contact details for the UK, but I've actually found a web page. If you are an EU citizen, or if you're in Europe, let's say, I found a web page that lists the data protection agencies for each and every country, along with the phone numbers, websites, and email addresses. And when I was speaking to the Information Commissioner for the UK, their office, earlier today, they did indicate that if they received enough complaints about this, they would be compelled to do something about it. So it's one of those issues where likely nothing will happen if nobody complains. But if you are affected by this and you are concerned, then the thing to do is to exercise your right to complain. And the one thing I was told as well was that you also have the right to complain anonymously, to make it clear that there will be consequences if you are identified by name. But Chloe, I guess I'm a little bit torn when it comes to, apart from advising that you complain about it, I'm a little bit torn with what I would actually do in terms of the congregation if I were a Jehovah's Witness. It's all very well for me to say, as a disassociated person, oh, you shouldn't sign it. But when you're actually in that situation with the elder stood in front of you, I don't think I could tell a witness to not sign it. I guess it has to be it depends on how passionately you care about it.
Yeah, I mean, also you have the right to revoke at any time. So what I was thinking was that as many people as possible should actually just ask and do like a data request. Oh, hi, can I ask you what data is actually being held on me? And you can write a letter that's dated, and they have to, within a certain period of time, provide you with everything that they have on you. And they can't, like John was saying earlier, was that people were writing things about him on the back of things to do with him. But in this law, you would have to be provided with everything that they have on you. So I would challenge everybody who's watching this video to actually do a data request and see what data they've got on you after the 25th of May. Because after this, I certainly am going to. It doesn't affect me in any way to just ask for that information now. And if you don't receive it, you can also then make a complaint. But as current witnesses, if you, like you said, I don't know, but I do have a point. From what Covert was saying earlier, was that you said, well, I don't think that they're actually aware that, maybe they're being that manipulative, maybe they're just kind of deluded on the matter. But I do think that they are deliberately withholding information, and they're giving the least amount of information possible to the general congregation members, because there is that other leaked document as well that we saw that says for elders only. I don't know if we can show that to people on the video, but in that video it says a law called the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, will become enforceable on the 25th of May 2018, and it explains what that law is, whereas they don't do that for the congregation members. And I thought it was very, very deliberate that people perhaps might not go online and just Google GDPR and find out what their rights are. So people might just sign it and think, oh, I trust them, like we all have done in the past. We trust them with our personal information. So, making it so that they're not giving that information to people makes me think that they are doing something.
Yeah, just to back up, sorry, what Chloe was just saying. I was just frantically looking for the document. I'm just going to show it quickly to our viewers. Chloe was referring to an announcements and reminders document which very clearly says for the elders only, and it begins by saying use of personal data on May 25th 2018, a law called the General Data Protection Regulation will become enforceable. So Covert, what were you going to mention?
Absolutely agreeing with Chloe, and just following up, the only way you can find out what the penalties are if you don't sign up is if you read that elders only letter. So as a publisher, you don't know if you're a physically in, mentally out Jehovah's Witness, you're like, will they disfellowship me? Will they reprove me? What will they do? The only way to find out what the consequences are, which is, no, you won't be disfellowshipped, they'll keep you as a publisher, but you will start to lose other things, is to read that video. Read that letter.
Which at the bottom says, Secretary, inform the body of elders if any publisher refuses to complete the consent form. I mean, that sounds ominous enough when you're a Jehovah's Witness, doesn't it?
It seems like it's just going to perk their senses to people who are, physically in and mentally out. They'll be like, oh, why don't they want to sign it? Oh, okay, well, let's have a meeting with them. Let's ask them more questions. Why don't you trust the brothers? What's your situation? What are you thinking about right now? It's a one-way path, really, from what we can see.
Indeed. So I guess the takeaway from this is that the Watchtower has become, over the decades, very Orwellian in its demands for information and its demands for data. to the point where, as I mentioned, there is a collision seemingly on the horizon where it has to confront the fact that a lot of what it's doing simply flies in the face of developed countries and their data protection laws. But if you are a Jehovah's Witness watching this, or you're physically in, mentally out, I guess we can't tell you what to do with the form. But one thing that you absolutely can do is register your complaint with your local data protection authority, provided, of course, you're in the European Union or you're in Europe. But if you're in America, brace yourselves, because Publisher ID is coming and it's going to affect the whole world. So on that ominous note, we will conclude our 11th episode of Watchtower in Focus. I'd like to thank John Redwood, Covert Fade, and Chloe for your wonderful insights.
And Scrappy.
And Scrappy the cat, who has been, he's been our spectator for the show. Our one and only live audience member, I should add. So,
although he may be interested in reading the news next time, so stay tuned.
A third contender, okay. So again, I hope you have found this video interesting. Please don't forget to subscribe for more episodes, and as always, thank you for watching.
Say